John Eliot Oldham, who was my grandfather, went to Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and he was class of 1888.
It says 98, is that incorrect?
That is incorrect. His wife was the class of 93, my grandmother, at Smith. Somehow the 90 got mixed up when I wrote it down. Everybody in the family was 5 years apart, 93 or 98, or my mother was 1918, but then I was 1944, and I sort of broke the thing. But my Aunt Anna had been class of 13. Her daughter, my cousin Nancy, or really my mother's cousin, was class of 43, but I was class of 44, and I just had my 50th anniversary there. My mother, 75th anniversary, and my grandmother, 100th reunion was the year before I had my 50th.
I see.
So it's going back a long time. Anyway, this is the class of 88 at Amherst.
Can you point him out?
All right, here he is.
Okay.
And I don't imagine there were too many college people in the family before that. I think that was something special. He was not a scholarly type, but he was a good student, and he used this as a way of launching himself into some kind of career as an investment banker, it turned out. I mean, because he didn't make a career of being a catcher, but he was a catcher. Here he is at 6 years old. He has long curls. This is grandfather after he became an investment banker. I didn't see a lot of him in that period. He spent 5 days a week in New York. He went down on the train, came back on the train.
Oh, he worked in New York?
Yes. But they lived in Wellesley Hills, Massachusetts.
So he had a separate house or apartment in New York?
No, he had an apartment in New York.
An apartment in New York.
And then he would spend the whole summer at Squirrel Island. He didn't work all summer. He'd be there building the tennis courts, taking care of the tennis courts, just having everything to do with the tennis tournament there. I mean, that was his main life then, was tennis. And I don't know if he even played tennis, but he certainly was very interested and was responsible for their having superb clay courts. He used to spend a lot of time experimenting with clay, and he sent all over the world, and he'd have all these chunks of dried clay, which looked a little bit like lava or something. They were very, or pumice or something, they looked very porous.
You used to see this, he used to keep them?
Yes, he kept them on his desk at Squirrel Island. One day, my brother Adam and I were down at the beach, and we were playing in the clay pit down there, and there was this beautiful gray, greasy clay, light gray, very nice, that children had always played with at Squirrel Island, and they used to mix it with the sand to build their dams and stuff, because there was a little spring that came down there. And one day I came home, and I was covered with it. Grandfather said, "What's that on you?" And I said, "Clay." And he didn't even know about the clay pit on the beach. And he thought that was very interesting, so I had to go and get him a sample of it, brought it home. And then they began to look, and they discovered that the little beach, that was not a swimmable beach, but it was a little low-tide beach, behind the tennis courts, had a very similar clay, and it had marvelous properties. And here he'd sent all over the world for clay samples, and this clay was better than any of them, and mixed with some modern kind of sprinkles that they put in to develop certain qualities in it. It produced a wonderful court. There were 6 courts that were used in the tennis tournaments once a year.
And that's what they did. They used the Squirrel Island clay for their own tennis courts.
Yes, it was amazing. Well, these are some pictures of the snapshots of the people who were involved with the tennis at Squirrel Island. First you have my grandfather there. Okay. And then you have Nellie Ho and George Mandel, and they used to run the Longwood tournaments. They're both from around Longwood, Mass, and they spent all their summers there at the island. But grandfather was the head of it. I mean, everybody associated John Oldham with the tennis. And Billy Merrill, he was the father, actually, of John Merrill, who developed kidney transplants, and he was an old islander, and I don't know that he had any special connection with the tennis there. And down here is Bill Andrews.
Who's Bill Andrews?
Bill Andrews was a Boothbay Harbor man with a tremendous accent, and he was very silent. There was an interesting story about him because one night my grandfather and George Mandel and Nellie Ho were sitting around the clubhouse looking out at the sunset, and it was gorgeous. I mean, it was just a spectacular sunset. And then old Bill comes walking along, and they're looking at him, and they say, it's really a pity. I mean, somebody like this lives here all the time, but doesn't probably know enough to really appreciate it. Curiously enough, sometime the following winter, it turned out that he'd been writing poetry, and pretty good stuff. And this became known, and then suddenly everybody was feeling quite embarrassed about having been so patronizing of Bill Andrews. But Bill was a very silent type and very tall, and he just worked with that roller, and he was just out there every day, and my grandfather could always count on him.
So he was rolling the courts.
Rolling the courts, right. So this is my grandfather sitting on the porch of the clubhouse where they had watched that beautiful sunset. That was in 1941. That's how he spent his last years at Squirrel Island, more sitting on the clubhouse porch rather than rolling the courts. But he walked down there every day and spent his whole day there. These are pictures from the tennis tournament at Squirrel Island. As the season progressed towards Fate Week, which was the third week of August, there was much more activity down there, and they finally put up this may be just before, I don't know, because I don't see the bleachers, but they put up bleachers with awnings on it for the tennis tournament. We had a tennis tee and a fate ball and all kinds of celebratory activities, and many people just came for Fate Week. That's John Oldham in his last several years at Squirrel Island. That's how he looked. And there may not have been any tournaments going on at that particular time, but that's very characteristic of him. And of course down here we have another picture of him in the same general period with his great-grandson, Joel Grossman.
I've changed.
This is a picture of the tennis tournaments, and that's the kind of awnings they had over the bleachers. It wasn't a very large tournament, but there's a great deal of interest in the play. And it seems to me that it's just been pointed out that I'm in that picture myself, which, right there, yeah, okay.
Yeah, how old do you think you were there?
Oh, I'd say 15.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great.
I don't think grandfather's in any of these, but this is something that
Just what the
brought
tournaments
into
look
being.
like.
Yeah. Well, this is grandfather in those middle years when he was working as an investment banker and going to New York, spending the whole week in New York. And I don't recognize him that well from these pictures. It seems to me that must have been before I really started noticing how he looked, because he had this very characteristic look, this very white hair, and that I remember him most, those last pictures we saw. In this picture, he's starting to look the way I remember him, but it was even more pronounced in the next few years as his hair got whiter. This also seems to be a very good and characteristic looking picture of him from that period, which, as I say, is a little before I start remembering him very well, but I think this is quite good. This is perhaps a slightly earlier picture of him, but all in his investment banking years.
Okay. So it says, Banker John Oldham of Boston, the government consults John for advice on railroad securities. Okay, well.
Yeah, and railroads were his main interest in investment. And unfortunately, he stopped being an investment banker while the railroads were still all right, and then they gradually began to lose value. But he was by then too old, and when you get old, you find it difficult to make changes. And the trust company where his will was probated were astonished when they opened up his portfolio and found there was almost no money left in it, because he had been very wealthy at one time, and it was just because he hung on to the railroads. We're looking at grandfather at Bridgewater High School.
Yeah, what year?
1883, yeah. Now, 1883, he graduated from Amherst in 88, so that was junior year.
And he's got a baseball bat in his hand. Was he liked baseball?
He was a catcher.
I remember.
No, I mean, he took it seriously. It's just he had less and less time for it as he got older, but that he considered himself a catcher.
And who are these guys?
Now, this is from this picture up here?
Yeah, now this says here, John Oldham here. Eliot Oldham right here.
There, right.
Okay.
Yeah, this is probably something in Booth Bay Harbor. I don't know.
Some crowd.
In the summers, they seemed to have a lot of parties, and people were there. He had a friend named Percy Brooks, who was the person who introduced him to my grandmother at Squirrel Island when she was 16.
So he met your grandmother on Squirrel Island?
Oh, yes, that's where they met.
So they were both Squirrel Island families?
Yes. Well, he may not have been a Squirrel Island family at the time. My grandmother was, because her father had built a cottage there. But he came down to visit Percy Brooks and met her, and then joined her family.